Some poets enjoy the fame and the adoration of a Robert Frost or a Maya Angelou, two poets of relatively recent times who were extremely well known and beloved by large audiences. Most poets, however, toil in what might best be described as obscurity. You've probably never heard of very many poets who are alive today. Sometimes I like to call attention to some very good poets who are working today, but not terribly well known. And I especially like to call attention to poets from Georgia. I'm a native Georgian, and I feel like giving some Georgians a little love. I want to talk about a poem now by a woman named Sandra Simonds. Simonds is a Georgia poet. She has spent most of her career at Thomas University in Thomasville, Georgia. That part of Georgia you can think of, depending on your perspective, as either the part of Georgia that just sort of kind of fades into North Florida, or you can think of it as the part of North Florida that just kind of fades into South Georgia. The border there is largely imaginary. There's no real landmark that I can think of that separates that part of Georgia from that part of Florida. And Sandra Simonds, indeed, spends time in both. She, I believe, to this day lives in Tallahassee and commutes into Thomasville. This poem is called August in South Georgia, clearly establishing its Georgia bona fides. Why do I drink so much gin? Has something to do with the way they burn the trees down here on either side of the highway. Man selling boiled peanuts, man selling handmade canoes. If you knew the South, you know a good woman can only really get the blues in the winter. Summer is meant for losing weight. No white people are going to talk about race. The Goodwood plantation I drive by every day has no memory. All those baby alligators and volunteer tour guides with their quaint anecdotes that lodge in your throat like the demented sun. Lot goes on here in this poem. And the first thing that I hope that you noticed was where I didn't pause. You don't stop at the end of a line of poetry when it wraps the sentences around the way that Simonds does in this poem, and I hope that it helped make a little bit more sense for me to read it that way. I also caught my own mispronunciation of one word, and I hope that didn't trigger anybody too much. But the question that opens the poem, why do I drink so much gin? This is a person who seems to be a little bit concerned, the speaker, about her. I'm going to treat the speaker as female because the poet is, and because there are references to a good woman. But it's a very dangerous thing to go around assuming that the speaker is always the poet, and I'm not making that assumption, but I am assuming a gender for the speaker. Why do I drink so much gin? As I said, shows some concern. Also, gin is a very English drink, you may know, and the English have long had a love-hate relationship with it. Let's take just a quick peek at something by William Hogarth from the 18th century. These were a couple of illustrations that he made of Beer Street and Gin Lane. Just think about the word street and the word lane. We think about street as, kind of a neutral place where people live and do business. Lane sounds a little sketchy, like the hidden lanes. And that definitely goes on in this poem. Over on Beer Street, people are they're industrious, they're prosperous. The man is contented with his stein of beer and his pipe in his mouth. The other man is producing art. Over on Gin Lane, the more downtrodden place, on the other hand, we see this one poor soul down in the front who's apparently starving to death while his dog does whatever it is that dogs do when they're looking for perhaps a morsel. And the woman who's nursing a baby, that baby is in dire straits and apparently is about to fall to the ground. The purpose, this is propaganda that Hogarth produced with the intention of trying to convince English people 250 years ago to turn away from unwholesome, addicting gin toward much healthier beer. Now, those are matters of perspective, but I think it shows you something about attitude that we can understand as well in Simon's poem. She says that the speaker says that the drinking of gin has something to do with the way they burn the trees down here on either side of the highway. If you've been to that part of Georgia or that part of the South, perhaps you're familiar with something called prescribed burning. That's an interesting choice of terms. Prescribed, just what the doctor ordered, perhaps. That is a very particular type of burning that happens among certain trees, and it's for purposes of reforestation. It's kind of like pulling the Band-Aid off of a wound. We have to get rid of the old trees in order to make space for the new ones to grow in. But while the trees have been burned or just shortly afterwards, it's kind of ugly to drive through down a road in that part of South Georgia or North Florida and see those wounds left behind by the burned trees. And then right alongside those, we have man selling boiled peanuts, man selling handmade canoes, perhaps made of some of the wood that didn't burn. If you know the South, the speaker continues, again establishing the part of the country where we are, you know a good woman can only really get the blues in the winter. Winter blues are a pretty common motif, and there are reasons: the lack of sun, the longer nights. These are connected with it. Summer, she continues, is meant for losing weight. Think of a time of year when it's really hot, and it is hot in that part of Georgia and Florida. I can assure you from the little bit of time that I've spent there. So it's just too hot to move around very much, and you don't eat a whole lot, and therefore you might lose weight. Then this line kind of comes in from nowhere. No white people are going to talk about race. This is kind of one of those don't picture a pink elephant kind of lines. If I tell you not to picture a pink elephant, what are you going to do? You're going to picture a pink elephant. So when the speaker says no white people are going to talk about race, well, what you're about to have here is a white person talking about race. The Goodwood Plantation, that's a real place. I drive by every day, has no memory. And here's the website for the Goodwood Plantation. It's been there for 190 years in North Florida. It's a place of opulence, of prosperity, of wealth. It's also a place where a lot of people have suffered and died. And something I couldn't help but notice when I visited the website was that at the very end of the fourth paragraph, which is the bottom of the part that you're able to see now, it says, for a time the plantation remained active as many formerly enslaved people worked the land as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And I want to focus just a little bit on that choice of words, enslaved people. I grew up in a time where we simply heard people described by the word that was the legal term of the 19th century, and that word was slaves. Normally, I tell people when you have a choice between saying things two-way and one way is more succinct, say it the more succinct way. I have to make an exception here. And so Jones's exception to the succinctness rule is if saying something in an extra word or syllable grants or acknowledges, and acknowledges is definitely the better word here, someone else's humanity, then go with a longer one, because enslaved people is much more humanizing than slaves. And it makes me wonder, I really do wonder, when exactly this poem was written, because there's a tacit acknowledgement of race in here, of acknowledging that although the owners of Goodwood from the beginning were certainly white people and most of the workers were enslaved people of color, that the contributions of those people must be acknowledged. And it helps, perhaps, if we start to think of them more as people than as slaves. I warned you, white men talking about race. The Goodwood Plantation I drive by has no memory. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more. All those baby alligators and volunteer tour guides with their quaint anecdotes that lodge in your throat like the demented sun. Now, I haven't gone to Goodwood. I haven't participated on one of the tours, so I can't tell you what the quaint anecdotes are. I suspect that there probably are baby alligators that are taken out and shown off, because baby alligators are kind of adorable and they can't hurt you. But I do think that for this speaker, as she deals with her consciousness of what has happened in her part of Georgia in the past and what continues to go on with what I'll correctly call the whitewashing that is probably mostly the case in Goodwood. I don't want people from Goodwood on here demanding equal time, but if you want to throw a comment in, you're welcome. I just suspect that there's a certain discomfort that the speaker feels, and that it might be enough to drive a person to gym. But I don't think that's where this poem ends. I do think that the statement that the speaker makes in this poem and her calling attention to the way that these quaint anecdotes of tour guides lodge in your throat like the demented sun, which does beat down, as I said, very hot in that part of South Georgia, I think that's the beginning of what we might describe as a prescribed burn. I think that in this statement, in this limited way, in what about 10 lines can do, the speaker, and indeed Sandra Simonds, are beginning to tear off a bandage to allow a wound to heal. And I think, and I will give credit to the people of Goodwood for moving from slaves to enslaved people, because I think that helps the process one small step further along. A wonderful poem that says a whole lot, and that I think will inspire people to do a whole lot of thinking, and I hope not a whole lot of drinking.